right, so get this. We're going deep today into a time in history that's just packed with surprises. Early 15th century global exploration. But not the stuff they teach in school.
No, not
like,
that.
forget Columbus for a minute.
Right.
Because while Europe was still, getting their act together,
Yeah.
China was launching these expeditions. That would just blow any explorer out of the water.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating comparison. We all grow up hearing about like Magellan and Columbus and all those guys.
Right.
These Chinese voyages, they were on a whole other level. We're talking like fleets that were so massive, Europe wouldn't even come close for centuries.
Okay, so paint a picture for me. What did these expeditions actually look like? Help me wrap my head around just the size, the ambition of it all.
Okay, so imagine this. Hundreds of ships.
Yeah.
Some of them maybe 5 times bigger than Columbus's Santa Maria,
Wow.
sailing across the Indian Ocean. And we're talking about tens of thousands of men, not just sailors. Diplomats, scholars, artisans, all traveling together on these incredible voyages. And they weren't just exploring, they were making a statement.
See, that's what I think is so interesting about this, right? It wasn't about conquering and colonizing, the European voyages that came later.
Yeah.
What was driving the Chinese to undertake these massive expeditions? What was the point?
Well, the emperor at the time, Yongle, he was aiming for something way bigger, projecting power, prestige. He wanted the world to see China's wealth, its technology, its culture. You could almost think of it like a gigantic PR campaign for the Ming Dynasty.
So instead of claiming land, they were winning hearts and minds.
Yeah.
How do you even go about impressing the world on that scale?
Well, they definitely didn't skimp on the budget. They brought these lavish gifts for the rulers they met. Silks, porcelain, exotic animals. Even a giraffe ended up parading through the streets of Beijing. Oh yeah. They set up diplomatic ties, encouraged trade, and left behind these amazing stone pillars inscribed with messages of peace and gratitude to Buddha. Like a powerful display of soft power.
It almost sounds too good to be true. Peaceful exploration on such a massive scale.
Yeah.
It's definitely a different story than what we usually hear about this period of history.
Right, exactly. And that's what makes it so compelling. These expeditions weren't about brute force. It was about showing off how sophisticated China was and, establishing its place as a global leader. But as we'll see, this approach, it takes a totally different path compared to what was brewing over in Europe.
Okay, so now I'm really curious. While China's out there sailing these peaceful treasure fleets, what's happening in Europe at this time?
Well, it's a stark contrast to China's, grandeur. The story of European exploration, it starts with a much smaller player, but just as ambitious, Portugal.
Portugal. Yeah, they were kind of the underdogs of Europe at the time, right?
Exactly. A small nation on the edge of Europe, not a lot of resources, but this burning desire to break free, from the economic constraints of the Mediterranean.
Right.
And that ambition, it was fueled by a potent mix of religious zeal and thirst for wealth. And it led them to a pivotal moment in 1415, the capture of Ceuta.
Ceuta, remind me, where was that again?
So Ceuta was this heavily fortified Muslim city in North Africa, and its location made it really important for controlling trade routes.
Sure.
Capturing Ceuta, that was a huge deal.
Huge in what way? What made it so important?
Well, first, it shocked Europe. Nobody expected this little nation to take on such a powerful target. But even more importantly, it gave the Portuguese a taste of what was out there, the riches and the opportunities that lay beyond the Mediterranean. They saw all that wealth flowing from the east, the spice trade in particular, and they realized they could be a part of it.
So this one victory, basically opened their eyes to a whole new world and just ignited this ambition to expand.
Exactly, but it wasn't all about economics either. They also saw themselves as warriors of Christ, driven by this, religious fervor to spread Christianity and challenge the Islamic world.
Right.
And it's this combination of economic ambition and religious zeal that set them on a course that would totally reshape the world.
Okay, so we have China out there making friends, influencing people with these incredible fleets.
Right.
And then we have Portugal making a bold statement with a strategic conquest. This contrast is fascinating. Where do we go from here?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, because even though these two powers were on opposite sides of the world with totally different approaches, their stories are about to become intertwined in ways that nobody expected.
Wow.
But to understand how we need to dive into the next chapter of their journeys.
Okay, now you've really got me hooked. I can't wait to see how these two contrasting approaches to exploration play out. Let's jump into part 2.
All right, so we're back and ready to dig into what happened next in our, tale of two explorations. Last time we left off with China making waves with those amazing, peaceful treasure fleets.
Right.
And then Portugal just starting to test the waters of global expansion with, the capture of Ceuta.
And those were some pretty significant toes they were dipping in the water there.
Yeah.
I mean, that one event really sent shockwaves through Europe,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
both in terms of military power and economic ambition.
Right. Because it wasn't just about taking the city itself. It was about what Ceuta represented, right? Like access to those super valuable trade routes that were the lifeblood of the East. So while China's busy, wowing everyone with their generosity and cultural influence, Portugal's got their eyes on a whole different kind of prize.
Exactly. For Portugal, it was all about breaking free from those Venetian and Genoese merchants. The ones who controlled all the Mediterranean trade?
They saw an opportunity to forge their own path to the riches of the East, and especially those spices everyone wanted.
And speaking of China, what happened to those impressive treasure fleets? Did they just keep on sailing forever?
Well, that's where the story takes a pretty dramatic turn. See, after Emperor Yongle died, things changed big time for China's maritime ambitions.
Oh.
His successor, Emperor Hongxi, he had a completely different vision for the empire. He saw those expeditions as a waste of resources and, a distraction from more important domestic issues.
So basically, internal politics just slammed the brakes on one of the most impressive displays of naval power in history.
Pretty much, yeah. It's a reminder that even empires can be at the mercy of, internal power struggles. And this shift, it was also fueled by Confucian scholars who were suspicious of all that maritime trade and foreign influence. They thought China should focus on its own affairs and, stick to its traditional agrarian society.
It's kind of ironic when you think about it. You have China with all the technology and resources to rule the seas.
Yeah.
And they decide to turn inwards, just as Europe starts to look outward. Makes you wonder how things might have been different if they had kept going.
No kidding. Imagine those gigantic Chinese fleets bumping into the Portuguese out on the open ocean. What a culture clash that would have been.
I know, right? I'm getting chills just thinking about it. But, well, I guess history had other plans. While China was pulling back, Portugal was like full speed ahead on their exploration. They had gotten that taste of the potential riches in the East, and they weren't letting anything stop them.
Right, and you have to remember, Portugal wasn't just sailing off into the unknown blindly. They were carefully setting up this network of trading posts down the African coast, securing their access to those markets in the East that they really wanted.
It's like they were building the foundation for a global empire, one strategic step at a time.
Exactly. And they weren't afraid to use force if they needed to. Remember those cannons we talked about? Well, they ended up being a key part of Portugal's strategy. They really invested in naval artillery, which gave them a serious edge, even against much larger forces.
So it wasn't just about how big their ships were. It was about having the best technology and being willing to use it. That's a powerful combo, especially when you're driven by ambition and this sense of destiny.
And speaking of destiny, this is where the story comes full circle. You see, as the Portuguese were working their way down the African coast, they were basically retracing the routes that Zheng Yi's treasure fleets had sailed just a few decades before.
You're kidding me. So they were following in the footsteps of giants without even knowing it. Talk about a missed connection.
It really is fascinating to think about, and it highlights just how global this period of exploration truly was.
Yeah.
Even though these two powers had completely different motives and approaches, their paths were intertwined.
Okay, so I've got China turning inward, Portugal pushing outward, and this incredible backdrop of interconnectedness happening all over the world. What happens next?
Well, that's where we'll pick up in part 3. We'll see what happened as a result of these different paths and how Portugal's pursuit of the East ended up changing the world as we know it.
Oh man, I can't wait. Let's dive into that final chapter. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into this, age of exploration. We've been following these two empires, right?
Yeah.
China showing off their power with these peaceful expeditions, and Portugal with this just unstoppable drive for wealth and power.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has. So last time we saw them kind of going their separate ways, China turning inwards and Portugal, pushing the boundaries of exploration,
Right.
unknowingly following in those footsteps of the Chinese treasure fleets. So now I really want to see what happened, because of these choices. What were the ripple effects as these two maritime powers went on these different paths?
Well, you can probably guess the consequences were huge. They shaped the world in ways that we still see today. So let's start with Portugal. Their quest for the East, well, it all led up to this huge moment in 1498, Vasco da Gama's voyage to India.
Ah, da Gama. Yeah, that name is practically synonymous with, exploration and discovering these new trade routes. But what was it about this voyage that made it so significant?
Well, it wasn't just about getting to India. It was about going around those traditional trade routes that were controlled by the Venetians and the Genoese.
Right.
Those middlemen who had like a total monopoly on Eastern goods for centuries.
Right.
Da Gama's voyage blew that monopoly wide open, gave Europe direct access to those spices and silks and all the treasures of the East.
So that was a game changer for Europe, economically, politically.
It was a huge turning point. It fueled the rise of European empires and, led to centuries of their dominance in trade and, unfortunately, colonial exploitation, too.
Yeah, it is a bittersweet realization, this amazing feat of exploration, but it also set the stage for some pretty dark moments in history.
It reminds us that progress, well, it's complicated. There are always unintended consequences. We can admire the ingenuity and determination of these explorers, but we also have to acknowledge the full impact of what they did.
For sure. And what about China? They chose a different path, right? Turning inwards instead of, going for global dominance. What were the long-term effects of that decision?
It's really tough to say for sure what would have happened if China had kept going with those massive expeditions. But I think it's safe to say that their choice to step back from the world stage, well, it had some lasting effects. They were still a major force in Asia, but their global influence definitely decreased.
It's like they missed their chance to really shape the world at a pivotal time.
Yeah, for sure. They prioritized internal stability and, those traditional values over expanding outwards. And that decision shaped their destiny in ways that we're still trying to figure out today.
It really makes you think, what would the world be like now if those treasure fleets had kept sailing? Would we have a more balanced global system? Or would those clashes of culture have sparked conflict and a very different kind of globalization?
It's a fascinating question, and one that I'm sure historians will be debating for years to come. But as we've seen in our deep dive, even events that seem completely unrelated can have these far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. The choices that emperors and explorers made, the conflicts between cultures and ambitions, technology, ideology, it's all woven together in history, and it's shaped the world we live in today.
Yeah. And when we understand the past, it helps us to understand the present and, navigate the future with more awareness and insight.
Very well said. So as we wrap up our exploration of early global exploration, I'm feeling a sense of awe, I think, at just how ambitious humans can be, and a real appreciation for how interconnected our world is.
And maybe a little bit of curiosity to dig deeper into those what-ifs, right? To find those hidden connections in history.
Absolutely. So we'll leave you to ponder those possibilities. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring and keep asking questions.